Extinction is supposed to be permanent. A species disappears, the fossil record closes, and the textbooks move on. But what if that's not always true? What if, decades or even centuries after science declares an animal gone, someone still sees it? A fisherman hauling nets at dawn, a ranger driving a wet road at 2 a.m., a biologist who wasn't even looking. We've gathered 15 animals the world officially buried, and 15 sightings that refuse to stay buried with them. Some are almost certainly mistakes. Others aren't so easy to explain away. Stay with us, because case number 1 isn't folklore. It's an animal scientists held in their own hands after the planet had mourned it for 65 million years. Let's start with the doubts that are easiest to resolve, and end with the one that isn't. Number 15. The thylacine. Picture Tasmania, 1982, 2 in the morning, rain hammering the windshield of a national park's ranger's truck. His headlights catch something crossing the road, dog-shaped, striped across the rear like a smaller cousin of a zebra. He watches it for several seconds before it slips into the bush. The thylacine stood about the height of a border collie, with a jaw that could gape almost 80 degrees, wider, proportionally, than a great white shark's bite. Officially, the species ended with Benjamin, the last captive thylacine, who froze outside his locked shelter in Hobart Zoo in 1936. So, for decades, the story stopped there. But here's where it gets strange. Since that ranger's report, hundreds of independent sightings, funded search expeditions, and camera trap operations have kept trickling out of Tasmania's forests. Still, most biologists reach for a simpler answer. Foxes, dogs, and mangy wombats have fooled trained eyes before, and no body, bone, or confirmed frame of footage has ever surfaced. No proof. But also, in that much unpatrolled wilderness, no certainty either. If a striped predator the size of a dog can vanish into rumor for 90 years, what else might be hiding in the places nobody's watching? Number 14. The ivory-billed woodpecker, Louisiana, 2004, the Cache River Swamp. A kayaker named Gene Sparling glides under cypress trees and watches a huge black and white bird, wingspan nearly a yard across, roughly the spread of a red-tailed hawk, flap away through the canopy. Ornithologists called it the Lord God bird, because that's what people supposedly shouted when they saw one. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had all but written it off after the last confirmed record in the 1940s. So when Cornell University sent a team to Arkansas following Sparling's report, hope spiked overnight. Therefore, in 2005, researchers published blurry video and dozens of new sightings as evidence of survival. But here's the catch. No clear photograph, no nest, no feather ever followed. Skeptics argued the footage matched a pileated woodpecker, a similar common bird, filmed at an awkward angle. In 2021, the species was formally proposed for delisting as extinct. And yet, researchers in Louisiana published fresh trail camera images in 2022 that reopened the argument all over again. One swamp bird, one blurry frame, and an entire scientific community still split down the middle. If the experts can't agree after 20 years of looking, what does that say about the cases with far less funding behind them? Number 13. The Cape Lion. South Africa, dusk, a private game reserve near the Western Cape sometime in the early 2000s. A guide swears the male in front of his Jeep isn't like the others. A heavier black mane running down past the shoulders, a thicker frame, almost a third larger than a typical savanna lion. The Cape lion was hunted to extinction by the 1860s, prized by colonial trophy hunters for exactly that dramatic mane. So the species was crossed off the map more than 150 years ago. But here's the twist. A handful of captive lions in European and South African zoos carry genetic traits that closely resemble historical Cape lion specimens, because some 19th century hunters kept live cubs instead of only trophies. Breeding programs have since tried to backbreed the look using these bloodlines. Still, geneticists are blunt about the limits. Appearance isn't ancestry, and a big mane doesn't resurrect a lost gene pool. No wild population survived. What's left is an echo, carefully curated in captivity. It's not a ghost sighting so much as a genetic haunting, proof that we can recreate the look of what we destroyed without ever truly bringing it back. Number 12. The Caribbean monk seal. The Yucatan coast, 1990s. A fisherman anchors near a limestone cave and sees a sleek gray head surface. Whiskered, thick-necked, nearly 8 feet long, about the length of a small fishing skiff. The species was last confirmed alive in 1952 at Fernandina Bank, hunted for centuries for oil and blubber until there simply weren't enough left to breed. Therefore, in 2008, the U.S. government officially declared it extinct, the first seal species lost to extinction in modern American waters. But here's where it complicates. Local fishermen across Haiti, Jamaica, and the Yucatan have kept reporting seal-like animals in remote coves for decades since. Scientists counter that these are almost certainly misidentified hooded seals or California sea lions that escaped captivity. Animals wildly out of their natural range, but easy to mistake at a glance. Still, the Caribbean's cave systems are vast, poorly surveyed, and historically exactly where these seals like to hide. No confirmed photograph has closed the case either way. A species can be legally extinct on paper, while its coastline keeps insisting otherwise. Number 11. The pig-footed bandicoot. Central Australia, decades after its last confirmed record in the 1950s, Aboriginal elders in the Western Desert describe a small hopping animal, about the size of a rabbit, with oddly narrow hoof-like front feet, almost like a miniature deer crossed with a kangaroo. Traditional trackers say they've seen its distinctive tracks in the sand as recently as the 1980s, long after Western science stopped looking. So the species sits in an unusual position, officially extinct by scientific record, but embedded in living oral history that tells a longer timeline. Here's the twist. Traditional ecological knowledge has correctly predicted the rediscovery of extinct Australian mammals before, because indigenous trackers read subtle signs that formal surveys often miss entirely. But researchers are careful here too. Track identification is difficult. Similar species leave similar prints, and decades-old memories can blur. No specimen, no photograph, no camera trap frame has confirmed a living pig-footed bandicoot since. What's left is two forms of evidence that rarely get weighed against each other fairly: a written record and a spoken one. Number 10. The Texas jaguar. The Rio Grande borderlands, 1990s onward. A rancher checks his cattle at sunrise and finds tracks the size of his palm pressed into dried mud, rounder than a mountain lion's, roughly the diameter of a coffee mug. Jaguars once ranged across the American Southwest, but ranching, hunting, and habitat loss pushed the population out of Texas by the late 1940s, with the last confirmed kill recorded in 1948 near the Sierra Madre foothills. Therefore, for over 70 years, jaguars were treated as a Mexican and Central American animal only. But here's where it gets strange. Since the 1990s, trail cameras in Arizona and New Mexico have repeatedly photographed individual male jaguars wandering north from Sonora, and Texas has logged its own unconfirmed track reports along remote stretches of border ranchland. Wildlife biologists are cautiously optimistic rather than skeptical here. These are likely genuine wandering males, not myths, though a breeding population in Texas itself remains unproven. Still no den, no female, no cub has ever been documented north of the border in this era. The jaguar isn't a ghost, it's a border crosser, quietly testing whether Texas is still its territory. Number 9. The southern marsupial mole. The Great Victoria Desert, 2010s. A mining survey team digs a shallow trench and finds something strange just beneath the surface. A small, blind, golden-furred animal, about the size of a mouse, with shovel-like claws built for swimming through sand the way a fish swims through water. This animal spends almost its entire life underground, resurfacing so rarely that most sightings are really just fresh tunnel tracks, delicate trails that collapse behind the animal like a wake behind a boat. Because it leaves almost no permanent burrow, formal population counts are notoriously unreliable, so its conservation status has swung between vulnerable and possibly locally extinct across different desert regions for years. But here's the twist. Aboriginal trackers and mining ecologists have documented fresh trails in areas where formal surveys found nothing for over a decade, suggesting a hidden, mobile population rather than a vanished one. Still, without direct capture, scientists can't confirm which populations persist and which have actually blinked out. It may be the strangest case on this list, not because the evidence is dramatic, but because the animal is almost designed by nature to never let us be sure either way. Number 8. The pygmy. China's Yangtze River, August 2007. Less than a year after an international expedition failed to find a single one. A local businessman named Zheng Yujiang films roughly 90 seconds of footage, a pale, long-snouted animal about the length of a small canoe, surfacing twice before disappearing beneath the water. In 2006, a 47-day, six-nation survey using hydrophones and visual scanning covered the dolphin's entire known range and found nothing, so scientists declared the species functionally extinct. The first cetacean lost to extinction in modern times, largely due to shipping traffic, dam construction, and industrial pollution. Therefore, Zheng's footage, filmed just months later, detonated through the scientific community. Chinese researchers who reviewed the tape confirmed the animal's movement pattern was consistent with a living pygmy, not debris or another species. But here's the counterpoint. One blurry sighting, however credible, isn't a breeding population, and no follow-up expedition has ever documented another living individual since. Functionally extinct doesn't always mean immediately extinct. Sometimes it means the last few survivors are simply too scattered to find each other, and too few to matter for what happens next. Number 7. The Irish elk. Technically not an elk at all, but the largest deer that ever lived, its antlers spanning up to 12 feet tip to tip, wider than a city bus is long. It vanished from the fossil record roughly 7,700 years ago, likely undone by a combination of climate shift and antler growth, so demanding it may have outpaced the animal's own nutrition, a genuinely fatal evolutionary trade-off. So this entry doesn't belong on the list because of eyewitnesses in the woods. It belongs here because of folklore. Bog carvings, medieval Irish manuscripts, and Highland Scottish legends describe massive antlered stags long after the species should have vanished from living memory, and for centuries historians dismissed these as pure myth. But here's the twist. Peat bog fossil finds across Ireland in the last 2 decades have been radiocarbon dated significantly later than previously assumed, suggesting isolated pockets may have survived thousands of years past the official extinction date, quite possibly into the edge of recorded human history. Still, later than we thought is not still alive today, and no serious researcher argues the Irish elk persisted into the modern era. What it proves instead is unsettling in its own right. Extinction dates aren't fixed facts. They're estimates, and estimates get revised. Number 6. The Columbia pygmy rabbit. Douglas County, Washington State, early 2000s. Wildlife biologists doing routine surveys in sagebrush country, the rabbit's only habitat, plants about knee-high across a flat, dusty landscape, start noticing something they weren't expecting to find at all. This subspecies had been formally declared extinct in the wild by 2001. Its population crashed to just a handful of individuals collected for a last-ditch captive breeding program, the smallest rabbit in North America, barely the size of a soda can, gone from its native range entirely. Therefore, when field teams began spotting wild individuals again years later, it looked at first like a miracle sighting straight out of this list's premise. But here's the real story, and it's more complicated than a ghost returning. Genetic testing showed some of the wild rabbits were actually descendants of the captive breeding program, deliberately reintroduced, while others turned out to be a related but distinct pygmy rabbit population that had simply gone unsurveyed. So this isn't quite resurrection and it isn't quite fraud. It's a reminder that extinct sometimes just means not looked for hard enough, and that the line between rediscovery and reintroduction can blur faster than headlines let on. Number 5. The Fernandina giant tortoise. Fernandina Island, Galapagos, February 2019. A joint expedition led by conservationist Washington Tapia hikes across a volcanic landscape of jagged black rock, still active, still hostile to almost everything that tries to live there. Then they find her, a female tortoise, roughly the size of a large ottoman, wrinkled and ancient, later estimated to be over 100 years old. The species, Chelonoidus fantasticus, had exactly one confirmed specimen before this. a single male collected in 1906, making this animal effectively invisible to science for 113 years, so long that many researchers assumed the species had quietly died out sometime in between. Therefore, her discovery wasn't a rumor chased down. It was a body, a heartbeat, a DNA sample confirming her species match. Here's where it complicates rather than resolves. A single elderly female cannot repopulate a species on her own, and despite tracks suggesting others may be out there, no second living Fernandina tortoise has been confirmed since. Named Fernanda, she now lives in a breeding center, genetically priceless and functionally alone. Proof that extinct can be wrong, and still not enough to undo the damage that made people believe it in the first place. Number 4. The Caspian tiger. The reed forests and river valleys of Central Asia, spanning from Turkey to western China, an animal built heavier and denser coated than its Bengal cousins to survive genuinely cold winters. Hunting, habitat conversion to farmland, and the deliberate poisoning of its prey pushed the subspecies to extinction by the 1970s, with the last confirmed individual killed in Tajikistan. So for 50 years, its range has sat empty on the map. But here's the twist that scientists themselves engineered. DNA testing in 2009 revealed the Caspian tiger was genetically almost identical to the Siberian tiger, essentially the same subspecies separated by geography rather than deep evolution. Meaning the extinct Caspian tiger's genome is, in a real sense, still walking around in Russia's Far East today. Conservationists have since launched a reintroduction program in Kazakhstan's Ili-Balkhash region, relocating Siberian tigers into the Caspian tiger's old range, betting that genetic near-identity is close enough to functionally reverse an extinction. Still, a relocated cousin isn't a resurrected original, and critics argue the label de-extinction oversells what's really careful rewilding. It isn't a sighting, it's something stranger, an extinction being edited after the fact, one genome at a time. Number 3. The passenger pigeon. Once the most abundant bird in North America, flocks so vast they reportedly blotted out the sun for hours, comparable in scale to a moving cloud bank stretching wider than most cities. Commercial hunting on an industrial scale collapsed the population from billions to zero in barely 4 decades, ending on September 1, 1914, when Martha, the last known individual, died alone in the Cincinnati Zoo, one of the most precisely documented extinctions in history. So unlike almost everything else on this list, there's no ambiguity about the ending. Therefore, the sightings that followed carry a different weight entirely. Scattered reports trickled in from rural Wisconsin and Ontario for years afterward, hunters and farmers insisting they'd seen pigeons matching the description flying in small groups. But here's the counterpoint researchers lean on hardest. Mourning doves and rock pigeons closely resemble the species at a distance and in poor light, and with the original population's extinction so thoroughly documented and its habitat so completely converted to farmland, biologists considered genuine survival essentially impossible. Still, the story didn't stay buried. It resurfaced in laboratories. Geneticists working from museum specimens have since sequenced the passenger pigeon's genome, and de-extinction projects have floated the idea of engineering something close to it back into existence, chasing not a sighting, but a rebuild. Number 2. The western black rhino, northern Cameroon, remote savanna scrubland patrolled by only a handful of rangers across an area larger than some small countries. Poaching for rhino horn, driven by demand in traditional medicine markets, collapsed the population from thousands to fewer than 10 individuals in barely 2 decades, and the subspecies was formally declared extinct by the IUCN in 2011, one of the fastest large mammal extinctions ever documented on the African continent. So the story, by every official account, ended there. But here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable rather than hopeful. In 2016 and again in 2020, ranger patrols in remote sections of the Cameroon-Chad border photographed fresh tracks and dung consistent with a black rhino, an animal roughly the weight of a small pickup truck, nearly impossible to miss and yet somehow unaccounted for. Conservation biologists remain deeply divided. Some argue these are almost certainly southern central black rhinos wandering north from reintroduction zones, not surviving western individuals, while others refuse to rule out a tiny, unrecorded remnant population in genuinely unpatrolled terrain. Still, no rhino has been captured, collared, or photographed directly. It's the rare case on this list where survival wouldn't just be a curiosity. It would be a last chance, still open, to save something everyone already agreed to grieve. Number 1. The coelacanth. And this is the case that changes how you should read every single entry before it. Off the coast of South Africa, December 22, 1938, a museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay Latimer is sorting through a fishing trawler's catch when she finds something that doesn't match anything in her reference books. A thick, blue-scaled fish about the length of a canoe paddle, with strange, fleshy, limb-like fins instead of ordinary ones. The species was believed extinct for roughly 65 million years, vanishing from the fossil record alongside the dinosaurs, so thoroughly gone that paleontologists used it as a textbook example of a living fossil that no longer lived. Therefore, when ichthyologist J.L.B. Smith confirmed the specimen's identity months later, it wasn't treated as a curiosity. It was treated as one of the most important zoological discoveries of the 20th century. Here's the twist that makes this case different from all 14 before it. This isn't a blurry photo, a disputed footprint, or a folk memory. It's a physical body, dissected, studied, and followed by a live population later confirmed off the Comoro Islands and decades after that off Indonesia, a second, genetically distinct species entirely. The counterpoint isn't skepticism here. It's scale. Coelacanths still exist today, in small, fragile numbers. Deep-diving fish rarely seen by human eyes, listed as critically endangered rather than extinct. And that's exactly the point this whole list has been building toward. An animal missing from the record for 65 million years came back, not as a rumor, but as proof. If that's possible, what does it really mean when science says the word extinct? 15 animals, 15 supposed endings, and at least one of them, the coelacanth, proves the word extinct isn't always as final as it sounds on paper. Some of these cases are almost certainly cases of mistaken identity, hopeful eyes doing what hopeful eyes do. Others are genuine scientific embarrassments, gaps in our surveying rather than gaps in the species itself. But taken together, they point at something science doesn't love to admit out loud. Extinction isn't a verdict handed down with total certainty. It's a best guess, built from the evidence we happen to collect, in the places we happen to look. So the real question isn't whether every animal on this list is secretly still out there. It's how many more extinct species are sitting in that same uncertain gap right now. Undiscovered not because they're gone, but because nobody's checked the right riverbank, the right cave, the right stretch of desert yet. If you've made it this far, you already know the kind of mystery this channel chases every week. Subscribe, and we'll keep digging through the cases science hasn't fully closed the book on.